Hello, how's everybody? Great. My name is Kirk Waller. For those I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, I'm the storytelling director here at Stagebridge. A couple of things I want to do before we start. One is make sure you turn off your cell phone. Don't be that person, right? I'm going to say it, and somebody's still going to have it go off in the middle of the story. Check your cell phones. If you haven't been in this room before, there's a restroom right over here. And I also want to make sure I introduce our wonderful staff here at Stagebridge. Our executive producer, our executive director, CEO, Jose Rivera. Our schools coordinator, Barbara Johnson. And Sadie has such a long title, I don't even know it's
Director of the Performing Arts Institute.
There you go. Director of the Performing Arts Institute. And Vicki is, I don't know your title, Vicki. Vicki is a
marketing coordinator.
Marketing, that's all right, and they're always so supportive. So, in a nutshell, what we do this time, we only have about maybe 3 or 4 more left. The next one's not until April, so I won't say much about the next one. But this is an opportunity for the storytellers to come and kind of spread their wings. They're not just telling a little 8 to 10 minute story like we usually do. And so I know I've had the pleasure of working with Bill, our first storyteller, and Eleanor has worked with Gay, who's here, and you'll hear from her in a little bit. And I think that's all I really want to say. I know you didn't come here, maybe? So, I would like to introduce Bill Zarchy. Bill has been in our class for about 1.5 years, maybe 2 years. We met in a storytelling workshop that we did here, and he's been coming and addicted ever since. And this is his first time outside of the classroom telling stories. So he is as excited, I think, as I am. Well, he's probably more excited than I am. But I'm really excited because I'm really looking forward to hearing his story. Please welcome. Oh, and he's doing 2 stories. So 2 stories, just so you know, 2 short stories. And let's welcome Bill Zarchy.
Thank you. Very nice to be here. I'm really excited to. This is my first time outside of class, although class is right upstairs. So it's not that far. I want to tell you, first story I want to tell you is a cherished story that's known in my family as Evelyn's story. It starts near the end of the 20th century, about 20 years ago. My Aunt Evelyn and Uncle Saul had an extra ticket to a show they were going to. They lived in the Bay Area here. And they reached out to a community of recent Russian Jewish immigrants who they'd gotten to know pretty well. And one of their friends in that community was unable to come, but she sent a friend of hers who my aunt and uncle didn't know. His name was Alex Levy. And Evelyn and Saul picked him up and they rode to this theater. He seemed like a nice enough guy. They chatted on the way. And they got to the theater and Alex looked at the program and he said, what show of Cole Porter is this? I don't know this show. I know his music. And Evelyn was intrigued, and she explained that it was a review. It was different songs from different shows. It wasn't an actual musical play. But she was intrigued because she'd met a lot of Russians, and very few of them knew anything about American culture, much less musicals from the 1930s. So she wanted to ask Alex about his background. And she said, how do you know the music of Cole Porter? He said, well, I come from a very musical family. My mother was a piano player. And then the show started, and they had to wait for the intermission. And during the intermission, they decided to pursue it. And my Aunt Evelyn and Uncle Saul started to ask Alex questions. And they said, well, where do you come from in Russia? He said, well, I grew up in Leningrad. But my family comes from a small village. You've never heard of it. It's called Village. Well, this rang alarm bells for my aunt and uncle because 100 years before, nearly 100 years before, at the beginning of the 20th century, 3 teenage girls from Village had emigrated to the United States. Their names were Anna, Bessa, and Chippa. Anna was my grandmother, Evelyn's mother. Anna, Bessa, and Chippa took a ship to New York. They were held at Ellis Island for a few days until they cleared, and then they settled in New York, and they lived the rest of their lives in the United States, eventually married and had families. Now, they tried very hard to keep in touch with the family back in Russia. They wrote letters back and forth. From time to time, they sent packages of clothing and packaged goods to the family in Russia. They sent photographs, and they got photographs back. And all through the 1920s, they kept in close touch, because what they'd left behind was a big family. Besides Anna, Bessa, and Chippa, there were 4 or 5 other siblings, the youngest of whom was a piano prodigy named Sonia, and several others. Sonia's mother, Anna, Bessa, and Chippa's mother, was named Bella, and their father was named Meyer. And Meyer was a well-known musician and music teacher in Vallige and in that area. And because he had red hair, he was known as Meyer der Geller, Meyer the Redhead. Now, as the 1930s approached, our family in New York definitely got the impression that the family in Russia was having a hard time because they were Jewish. They were under intense scrutiny from the Soviet government. They were sometimes accused of being spies. And the family in New York got a very strange letter from someone they didn't know. It was from a woman writing to them saying, "Please don't send more packages and letters to your family. The police are suspicious of them. Please send them to me instead, and I will take your letters and packages to the family." Well, the New York family didn't know what to make of this. I mean, it seemed, on the one hand, like a sincere appeal that someone trying to help because the woman was Gentile and wasn't under suspicion, wasn't Jewish. On the other hand, they thought maybe they're playing into the hands of the government or the police. So they weren't sure what to do. They stopped the packages, and after a while, correspondence between New York and Vallige slowed down, and eventually it stopped. And that was the last the family heard much from Vallige until 1942. In the middle of the Second World War, German troops, on their way to invading Russia, Hitler's great folly invading Russia, just like Napoleon's, on their way to invading Russia, German troops stopped in Vallige. They rounded up all the Jews, they locked them in several barns, and they set fire to them. And in a very short time, they killed over 1,400 people. Now, back to Alex. Evelyn and Saul, in the intermission for the show, they had discovered they said, "Tell us more about your family." He said, "Well, I know about Cole Porter because I come from a musical family. My mother was a concert pianist." And Evelyn and Saul, well, she said, "Well, why was she in Leningrad?" She moved to Leningrad from Vallige to go to the conservatory. "And what was your mother's name, Alex?" Alex said, "My mother's name was Sonia." And Evelyn looked at Saul and said, turned back to Alex and said, "And what was Sonia's mother's name?" And he said, "Sonia's mother's name was Bella." "And what was your grandfather's name, Sonia's father?" "Oh, my grandfather was named Meyer." And Evelyn and Saul both said, "Meyer de Geller?" And Alex said, "Well, yes, how did you know?" And Evelyn explained that she and Alex were first cousins. Now, of course, they were completely astounded by this remarkable coincidence, and after the concert, they went back to Alex's apartment, and he showed them the family photo album that he brought over from Russia 8 years before. And in the family photo album were a number of photographs that Evelyn recognized. There were pictures that her mother had brought over from Russia when she emigrated. There were pictures that the New York family had sent back to Russia. Clearly, they were cousins. It was quite remarkable. Over the next few years, before my aunt and uncle both passed away, they became very close to Alex, and they introduced him to the rest of the family. He's a wonderful guy and quite a great piano player himself. In the next few months, Evelyn and Saul, actually driving down Foothill Expressway, they lived down on the peninsula, they lived only about 5 miles away from Alex, and driving down Foothill Expressway over the next few months, they passed Alex on the road and waved several times, and they realized that in the 8 years that he'd lived there, they probably had passed him numerous times without knowing. Several months later, there was a family reunion in San Jose. Alex revealed that there were more Russian cousins, descendants of Meyer and Bella, who lived in Minnesota, and they came out for the reunion, and so my dad and his sister, my Aunt Ellen, sat at a table with Alex and 4 other Russian cousins whose existence they hadn't even known of until just recently. Now, my kids were trying to make sense of all this. They were quite young at the time. And my son Razi said to me, "So Daddy, is this like if Danny and I didn't see each other for a long time, and then we did?" And I said, "No, what this is like is if you and your brother never saw each other again for the rest of your lives. And then one day, 100 years later, on the other side of the world, your children met each other and realized you were family." That's what it was like. The other story I want to tell you is something very different. There's a story that comes from my travels. I was very fortunate for over 40 years to work as a cinematographer and very lucky to travel around the world a number of times, and filmed on 6 continents in nearly 30 different countries. I've been to Japan 10 or 11 times. I actually don't know. China 4 times, all over Europe. I've been to South America, to Africa 1 time. You'd think that after all this that things would start to get easier, but that wasn't always the case. I was hired about 5 years ago to travel to Shenyang, China, in the northeast corner of the country, in the area formerly known as Manchuria, to interview a prominent radiologist at a hospital there for a story about diagnostic imaging for a healthcare company based in the Netherlands. I can't tell you the name, but it's Philips. And we've done a lot of work for Philips. And the 4 of us who were traveling on this crew needed visas for China, and we went to the visa office at the Chinese consulate in San Francisco. And the process was a little bit difficult. We were standing in the hallway, talking to a visa clerk who was behind a glass partition, talking to us through a microphone, handling all of our documents with rubber surgical gloves. And clearly there was something unusual about our case. We were handing her passports, we had extra photos, we had letters of invitation, lists of our equipment, because we were going to bring all of our camera equipment from here, visa applications. And she'd get each document, and then she'd go in the back, and she'd talk to her superiors, and they'd gesture, and they'd do this, and they'd point to us, and point to the papers, and then she'd come back, and she'd ask us a question. And then she'd go back, and she'd talk to them, and they'd point and argue, and we couldn't figure out what was happening, but we were an unusual case. I mean, they process hundreds of visa applications there every single day, and they're mostly for tourists, and it's mostly really straightforward. But we were applying for business visas. We had been told many times, do not apply for journalist visas because the Chinese government is suspicious of journalists. They're afraid that you'll come in and film some unflattering aspect of Chinese society and put it on television. And so we kept saying, not journalists, not for television. We explained that it was about diagnostic imaging, which meant nothing. And eventually, she sent us away, we came back, and eventually we got our business visas. We thought things were fine until we landed a few days later in Beijing, where we had to transfer to a flight to Shenyang. And when we landed, official China bit us in the butt. A very, very young man in a very fancy uniform was challenging us and basically would not allow us to bring our equipment into China. Now, I'd been there 9 months before. The engineer I was traveling with was on the same crew. We both had China business visas from then, 1 time only, that were in our passports. We were bringing almost exactly the same equipment. It was even the same Dutch client whose name I can't tell you. And we met up with our Chinese producer, Andrew Leung, met us in the airport in customs. And Andrew talked to the very young man in the very fancy uniform, and he came back to us and he said, big problem. He said, the problem is you have business visas. We said, yeah. He said, well, this customs guy says business visas are only good for business meetings, not for a video shoot. You should have journalist visas. We said, Andrew, that's the opposite of what everyone's always told us. He said, I know, let me negotiate. And he went back to the guy, and they were talking back and forth, and then he came back to us, and Andrew said, I've solved the problem. They're going to impound your camera body. We said, how does that solve the problem? He said, trust me. Just give him the camera body. They're going to let you take in everything else. So we handed over our $60,000 Panasonic 3700 high definition professional video camera body in a cheesy cloth bag with a tiny little luggage lock on it to the customs guy in the fancy uniform. He locked it in a closet and wrote out a receipt. We had a handwritten receipt in Chinese on shiny thin paper. And we had to run for our flight. And on the way, we were very glad that they were letting us bring in the other 12 cases of our equipment. We had our special lenses, we had our audio equipment, we had our monitors, our tripod, our camera controller, and we had a very special accessory that allowed us to film interviews with the subject looking directly into the lens. And we had all that stuff. We just didn't have a camera body. But Andrew said, not to worry. He says, I have a guy going to a rental house in Beijing right now. He's on his way. He's going to rent the same camera body, get on the midnight flight to Shenyang, and meet us on the set tomorrow. We said, great. Okay. And we hopped on our flight. We had no choice. We couldn't stay in the airport. We got on the flight to Shenyang. We pulled in there. We went to our hotel, and we were, as you can imagine, tired from a long flight and kind of annoyed at all this that had happened. And we just wanted to have dinner quickly and go to bed. So we looked around, and we were staying in a Kempinski hotel, which is a German hotel chain. And the main restaurant on the ground floor of the Kempinski was a Bavarian beer hall. It's called the Polaner Brauhaus. And we looked in there, and the idea of German food for our first night in China was just way too incongruous. So we ate at the small Chinese restaurant on the second floor of the hotel, which wasn't very good, but it was filling, and we went to bed. The next day we ran off to the hospital. We met the prominent radiologist. We filmed his interview. We had a huge Chinese lunch because Andrew set up a big banquet for us for our crew lunch. And we really had our fill of Chinese food. It was wonderful. We worked with a local crew as well. And when we got back to the hotel that night, after a long day of work, the idea of German beer sounded really good. So we went to the beer hall, and it was like we were in Munich, like stepping into Bavaria. Dark wood paneling on the walls, brass fittings and railings everywhere, a whole wall of personalized beer steins belonging to regular customers. In the back was Shenyang's only microbrewery. It was an enormous room, probably would have held 300 people. We sat down, we ordered beer and food, and we started to look around. And across the room from us, there was a small stage and a band playing. And the band, there were two guys and a girl in front. The whole band was wearing tight green pants and spangly tops. The three up front were dancing and singing. There were two girls in back, one playing the bass and one playing the keyboards. They obviously had a drum machine because there was no drummer. And they had a computer with flashing colored lights, and it was you know, disco-esque. We watched for a little while. They played 80s and 90s American rock and roll. Loud enough that it could kind of get your feet tapping, but not so loud that it impeded conversation. It was kind of the perfect volume. And we watched for a little while. They were good. Their moves were good. Their vocals were good, but they just looked kind of bored. But we were still tired. We ate. We started back to our rooms, and as we were leaving, we noticed that the band took a break and was starting to go around from table to table to greet people. So we went off to work the next day and went to the hospital. We filmed an interview with the nurse of the prominent radiologist. We filmed some scenes around his clinic. We filmed a procedure, and that night we were done. We'd come a very long way for 2 days of filming, and we were We were done with everything, and we were in a mood to celebrate. So we went back to the beer hall. And we tried to order martinis, but they were really unclear on the concept. Now you have to understand the cultural clash that was happening here. Staff was almost entirely Chinese, and they were wearing lederhosen, Oktoberfest costumes, dirndls, if you know what a dirndl is, and they didn't know for martinis. They brought us Remy Martin cognac, which had a lot of the same letters as martinis. Really does not taste the same. We sent that back. They said, well, we'll send you the only German-speaking waiter in the place. And I could ein bisschen Deutsch sprechen, but it was an odd choice. I think they thought, well, we're European, which is what they say in Asian for Caucasian. We're European, he's European, so obviously you can talk to each other. No, he wasn't very interested in helping. And so we just ordered beer again, and we ordered a bunch of sausages and some salads, and we laid out a little buffet for ourselves. And this time we sat a lot closer to the band. Now they were wearing blue and white sailor suits, and they looked really cute, and they were jumping around, and nobody was dancing, but it was fun to have them there. And when the band took a break, they came over to our table, and they greeted us, and they were very sweet. They were also very sweaty and wearing heavy stage makeup, and looked a lot less cute up front. And they asked where we were. They told us that they were from Manila, from the Philippines, and that they'd been playing at the Kempinski for 8 months in a gig that could last a year. And I started to wonder, wow, I'll bet the idea of going overseas to play in China sounded really glamorous, and now they were in Shenyang, which was a really bland, boring industrial city, and maybe it wasn't quite so glamorous as they thought. And one of the girls, as they started to go back on stage, winked at us and she said, I'm going to dedicate a song. Oh, they asked where we were from. And we told them we were from San Francisco, and they oohed and ahed because they knew San Francisco was a beautiful place. So one of the girls winked at us and she said, we're going to dedicate a song to you, something to remind you of home, because we're sure you must be homesick. Now, we'd just left home on Sunday, and we were going back in a couple of days, and so I was thinking, they must be really homesick. But nevertheless, as they went on stage and started to play some other things, I began to wonder, what San Francisco song would they dedicate to us? Would they know that Otis Redding was sitting on the dock of the bay in San Francisco? I could hear Eric Clapton's sweet licks. I got the blues from my baby on down in San Francisco Bay. Hey, hey, hey. I could see Jeanette MacDonald and Clark Gable striding across the screen after the 1906 earthquake, singing, San Francisco, open your golden gate. I could hear Eric Clapton and the Animals in that song from the 60s. Walls move, minds do too, on a warm San Francisco night. And then I knew what song it had to be. I knew it would be everybody's favorite Northern California anthem, usually sung by an Italian-American from Astoria, Queens. The song that my beloved Giants play at every home victory. I left my heart in San Francisco, high on a hill, it calls to me, to be where little cable cars climb halfway to the stars. I mean, that had to be it, right? Wrong. Which is how it happened that a Filipino band in a German hotel in Shenyang, China, in the area formerly known as Manchuria, dedicated a song to their new best friends forever from San Francisco, one of whom was born in Bombay and one born in New York. A familiar toe-tapping rhythm started, first the bass, and then one of the guitars, and then the drum machine, and finally the vocals in full, rousing, redneck rock Leonard Skinner harmonies. Sweet home Alabama, where the skies are so blue. Sweet home Alabama, Lord, I'm coming home to you. A for effort and sweetness. D for geography. And kind of the next day, we got our camera back.
Yay. Not a bad time for the first time off, huh?
Thank you.
Very good, thank you.
How do we start?
And I'm gonna